Hi, my name's Phil. I like talking about politics, and in this video I'd like to discuss the speech which Prime Minister Rishi Sunak gave yesterday, in which he attempted to buy himself more time with some nice sounding promises, which on close inspection are all fairly worthless. But the purpose of the promises, I suspect, was not to get the public on side. It wasn't to build up an election platform. I think it was really just there to persuade his own MPs to give him time. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So the situation that Rishi Sunak finds himself in politically is that although he has the support of most of his MPs, that's not enough. And there are a large minority. We're not talking about just usual rebels. There's a large minority who do not approve of him. Now, you don't expect many political leaders to be considered the best choice universally. Everyone will have a different idea about what's the best choice, but you get behind your leader for the common good. But many Tory MPs desperately think, like so convinced, that Boris Johnson would be better and should return. In fact, many of them think he should never have gone in the first place. You know, Sunak knows that this winter is already unfolding as anyone could have foreseen, and that is not good for the government. Rishi Sunak, although he gave a speech yesterday, he's not been out and about. He's not been doing visits to hospitals. He's staying well clear, and so is his health secretary. He also knows that the May local elections are going to be a mess as well. He's currently unable to get any of his own legislation through. The only bills passing through Parliament right now really are those that were started by Boris Johnson, and it's not anything that Sunak can point to and go, that's mine. So he needs his MPs to behave themselves. He needs his MPs to say, look, lend me a bit of trust, go along with things. I'm going to put legislation before the House. You need to vote for it. Judge me later. I'm going to make these promises. I'm going to keep them. Judge me later. But for now, pass my bloody bills. And I think this speech with the 5 promises was in aid of that, because the aims themselves are worthless. They sound really nice, but they're worthless. I'll go through them quickly, then one at a time. So, halve inflation this year, grow the economy, make sure national debt is falling, reduce NHS waiting lists, and new laws to deal with the channel crossings. Now, the first 4 are the sort of things that would get approval across the political spectrum. Everyone's in favour of those. If he was actually delivering it, that is. And the final one was, of course, a bit of red meat to the gammons. Now, before I go over each individually, worth pointing out that even if some of them are not objectively achieved, and none of them will be objectively achieved, that doesn't matter necessarily politically. The Conservatives have a fairly established record now of just claiming that they've achieved things and either misusing or even just making up statistics to demonstrate it to the unwary. Case in point, the £350 million per week for the NHS. This never materialised. In fact, the NHS actually keeps getting less money in real terms. But various Tory ministers and ex-ministers claim that the NHS got the funding. Oh no, they got the funding. The public aren't convinced. The public know it's rubbish. But the likes of Jacob Rees-Mogg last week, I think, or was the week before, was just telling an audience member at question time, no, the NHS got that money. No, it didn't. Sunak will do the same with these promises. He'll just say they happened whether they happened or not. So the first one, he will halve inflation this year. Okay. Inflation is forecast to halve this year. If Sunak took himself off for a year-long round-the-world holiday, it would halve without him doing anything. Inflation's not a thing that goes up to a particular level and stays there unless you bring it down. Inflation is just a percentage measure of how much more expensive things are compared to a previous period. Inflation halving, for example, doesn't mean that things suddenly get cheaper. It just means they still go up, but they go up by half as much. So instead of food going up by about 14%, as it did in 2022, it'll go up by about 7%. But that's on top of the 14% it already went up. And we know also what some of the major factors driving it were. And we know that some of them have subsided. The massive one was, of course, fuel costs. These have come down. So if inflation is half of the 2022 value in 2023, it's not down to anything Sunak or Hunt have done. It's down to factors that are already in place now. This is like throwing, it's in the stream, this is like throwing a ball way up into the air and it continues to ascend and you tell the assembled crowd, I'm going to use my magic powers to bring that ball back down to earth. and it goes up and it stops and it comes back down and the assembled crowd go, oh, he's a wizard. No, it was going to happen anyway. So this is a pointless promise designed to fool those who do not understand how percentages or economic gravity work. The second one about growing the economy. He's not going to do this, but he is going to claim that he has. See, with economic growth, it's all about the baselines, isn't it? What do you compare it to? For example, as of the end of 2022, we were still the only G7 economy not to have seen our GDP go back up to pre-2019 levels. Brexiteers who try and claim that our trade is flourishing, and I may have to do a specific video on that one before long, seem to ignore the fact that our economy is smaller. How's our trade flourishing when our economy is getting smaller then? It's the only country to be smaller. Well, in the G7. So nothing to do with our common problems of Russia and COVID. But what they do is every time the news reports that the economy grew, remember, it's only grew compared to the previous quarter. So if they announced that the last time the economy grew was in the second quarter of 2022, so they announced that, and it grew compared to the first quarter in 2022, oh, the economy grew. And then when it doesn't grow so much, they keep quiet. Or they blame something else. Sunak will do the same. If he's going to grow the economy, the baseline should be the point at which he became Prime Minister. That's where he started. At the very least, the date when he made the promise, which was yesterday. Will there be a point before the election where our economy is larger in real terms than now? Almost certainly not. Remember, it's already shrunk a bit. But still, almost certainly not. Because it's going to carry on shrinking. But just as inflation always comes down, recessions always end. You don't have to do anything. It's because a recession, again, it's a percentage that just compares your GDP with the previous 3 months. Doesn't compare it with 2 years ago or anything like that. Just the previous 3 months. So we will exit recession at some point, because what will happen is the economy will get smaller and smaller and smaller, and then it'll get a little bit bigger than it was, but still smaller than it is now. And it'll be growth. It'll technically be growth. There will come a quarter when our economy grows compared to that previous quarter. Sunak will claim that as he's grown the economy, but the economy will still be smaller than when he made the promise. So the political game here will be to point that out to the public. The third one about falling national debt. Now, this is an incredibly foolish policy to even pursue during a recession. Borrow in a recession, pay it back in growth. That's how you run the economy. But politically, sounds like a good policy. Oh, debt's bad, so reducing debt, that's good. The question is, can he do it? It is tricky, because Hunt's budget statement, which of course he was very much involved in, committed the government to loads of borrowing all the way up to the next election, and then leaves the following government to clear up the mess. But if Sunak really wants some figures to show that national debt is falling before the election, I suppose it's technically possible. It's difficult when the economy is shrinking and public spending has already been cut to the bone. But the recent policies of giving public sector workers very severe real terms pay cuts after already having over a decade of pay cuts. And Sunak plans to do the same next year. He says he's going to halve inflation. So inflation, he reckons, is going to be about 6% next year. Well, it probably is. He reckons, as well as giving nurses, for example, the severe pay cut they've had this year, that he can get away with a 2% pay award next year. Well, that will still be a 4% real terms pay cut on top of all the other pay cuts. But that's the sort of thing that he would have to do to meet this goal. You know, crush wages of public sector workers. But can he survive the political consequences of doing that? Fourth, NHS waiting lists to fall. Well, this is another one that will happen without him doing anything if he chooses his own time frame. Waiting lists, of course, are going to get smaller at the end of summer than right now when we're into another Tory winter crisis. But how much does he think they'll fall? Will they fall down to Remember, they were already high before COVID. They're blaming COVID. Oh, it's all to do with COVID. No, it's not. They were really high before COVID. They're at 7 million right now, which is way higher than they were. Like dropping to 6 million, that's not going to be worth a round of applause. That'll still be above pre-COVID levels. So he needs to say how much it will drop by and what he's going to do to achieve it. Because right now, he hasn't promised any new funding. He hasn't announced any plan that links government action with the reduction in waiting time. So if his plan clearly is to wait for waiting times to fall a little compared to now and go, there you go, I made them fall, look at that. I'm a man of my word. So as with inflation and growth, he's going to misuse statistics here to choose a time frame that allows him to fiddle it and claim success. But this is especially one of the ones that makes me think this is more about keeping his MPs on side for a bit longer rather than really building up an election platform. Because people will judge waiting times at the election, not a time of Sunak's choosing. If waiting times are still really high at the election, and they will be, unless he literally just crosses people off it and says, oh yeah, you were going to get this surgery, now you're not going to, go away. You know, unless that happens, then he isn't going to be able to back this promise at the election. In fact, it will be a problem for him, especially if the waiting list has gone up again. Finally, introducing new laws to allow people who come to the UK illegally to be detained. That's what he said. One of the stupidest political lies you can fall for. If someone is doing anything illegally, it means we already have laws that allow them to be detained. The police, of course, can detain people who are breaking the law. That's what they do. New laws are introduced in order to make something that was perfectly legal suddenly illegal. If you need to introduce a new law to detain someone for anything, for whatever particular action, you are saying that that action is currently lawful. And of course we know what they mean. They don't mean people come into the country illegally, because they can already be detained and deported. No problem. No court has ever put a block on that. Doesn't happen. What they mean is new laws to make lawful asylum processes unlawful. But this is a matter of international law. We can't just change that unilaterally. To change it in UK law, or to change it in the UK, we would have to withdraw from the relevant international treaties, the Refugee Convention in this case. And there are plenty of gammons who want us to do so. But being realistic, the government aren't going to do that. So this is a promise which goes nowhere at all. If they want to reduce the channel crosses, they can do that. But they do not need a new law. They need a new processing centre in France. They won't do that. So this promise is not intended to be achieved. Just a way of saying to the xenophobes, I'm going to deliver this. Give me time. I promise. This is my cast iron promise. You can judge me later. Just give me time now. Labour described the aims as so easy it'd be difficult not to achieve them. Now, this is the obvious response, obviously, from opposition, because if Sunak manages to convince people that he has met them, Labour can just point out there was no ambition in the promises at all and that people's lives are still shit. If he fails to achieve them, and objectively he will, then Labour will just say he failed to clear his own very low bar. And nothing will avoid the fact that come the election, the NHS will still be in tatters, the economy will still be badly broken, and the Conservatives can't solve their engineered migrant crisis with fantasy promises of legislation that can't actually achieve what they say it will. If he even tries, all it will do is draw international condemnation, and Sunak has shown signs that he realises he needs to form closer relations with our international allies. Giving in to the gammons will just achieve the opposite. But Sunak is in the same trap that Johnson was, in that their immediate future is dependent upon those gammons around them. You know, the far-right MPs who speak for them. So he needs to keep them on side. His authority is dependent upon keeping those swivel-eyed loons in a state of belief that they're getting what they want. And just as with Johnson, every time his authority is particularly weak, he'll have to move some of those plans along to keep them on side, to tell him, yes, we're on with it, we're prioritising it now. Johnson did it all the time. Every time he was under pressure. But there were a few times when the pressure eased. It was only when the pressure stopped easing that he got trapped. I don't think the pressure is ever going to ease for Sunak. You know, winter is very, very bad news for him right now. When we exit the winter into spring, we're heading to the local elections. Incredibly bad news. Still, it does seem to be that this is a typical case of saying whatever people want to hear now and hope for a miracle to occur to save you from having to deliver. Maybe he's hoping for another international crisis to occur to hide the inevitable failure on these promises. You know, just like COVID covered for them with Brexit. Maybe they're hoping something will cover for this. But there we are. Those are my thoughts. Let me know yours in the comments below. Hope you found the video interesting. If you did, please click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, the join button for memberships. And until next time, I'll see you later.